You want to play hardball over water rights? Fine. Let's see how that shiny lakeside resort of yours looks when the shoreline turns into a cracked, muddy wasteland. I'm standing here beside a century-old valve, the one that controls the entire lake system feeding Willowbrook Resort. The same system that keeps the Homeowners Association president's multi-million-dollar vacation rental empire afloat. 3 hours ago, while I was sitting in a hospital room with my daughter during her cancer treatment, they bulldozed my great-grandfather's barn. Called it an emergency demolition for community safety. What they don't know. My family built this dam back in 1924, and we still hold the original water rights deed. Karen Whitmore, the queen bee of our HOA, just made the biggest mistake of her manicured country club life. She thinks I'm just some grieving single dad she can push around. She's about to find out why you never corner a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The smell hit first, diesel fumes laced with sawdust, sharp and bitter in the late afternoon air. I pulled into the driveway. Emma slumped against the passenger window, her small frame drained from another brutal chemo session. And then I saw it. A massive yellow excavator parked where my great-grandfather's barn used to stand, sitting there like a steel vulture among a heap of splintered, century-old beams. Wood that had weathered every storm since the Roaring Twenties, now reduced to jagged fragments scattered across the yard. The sight punched the breath out of me. My knees buckled, and for a second, the world tilted. That barn wasn't just wood and nails. It was the last real piece of my father, gone only 6 months now. Every summer of my childhood had been spent in that barn, Dad teaching me how to hold a hammer, how to sand wood smooth, telling me stories about Great-Grandpa William and the days when neighbors showed up for each other, building things that lasted generations. Daddy, where's Great-Grandpa's barn? Emma's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it sliced right through me. I'd promised her we'd fix it up once she got better, sand the walls, maybe add solar panels, turn it into her art studio. She talked about painting the inside a bright teal, hanging fairy lights from the rafters. Now it was just rubble, pieces of our plans scattered across the lawn like broken promises. I could almost hear Dad's voice from our last conversation before the cancer stole him. That barn holds our family's story, son. Promise me you'll take care of it. I had failed him. Failed every generation of my family in one brutal afternoon. A stocky guy in a hard hat jogged toward me, clipboard in hand, wearing the look of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. You Marcus Sullivan, he called out, his tone awkward. Sorry about the timing, man. Here's your paperwork. He shoved a manila envelope into my hand, backing away like I was about to explode. Smart guy. He wasn't wrong. The envelope felt heavy, the kind of weight that shifts the ground under you. I tore it open right there in the driveway while Emma watched from the truck, her wide, tired eyes following every move. She wasn't just worn out from treatment. There was something else there. Fear. At 12 years old, kids like her read adult faces like they are survival manuals. Emergency demolition notice. The words screamed at me in bold red print. Issued by the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. Effective immediately, citing structural safety concerns and community flood risk. I checked the time. Stamped at 2:47 p.m. I'd been at the hospital with Emma from 1 to 4:30. The parking validation receipt was still in my wallet, proof. The notice claimed they'd made multiple unsuccessful attempts to reach me by certified mail and in-person visits before tearing it all down. That was their first lie. I'd been home every single day this week except for today. They'd waited. They'd timed this perfectly, knowing I wouldn't be here to stop them. Daddy, did they take pictures first? Emma's voice was soft but sharp with focus. She was already pulling out her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she started snapping photos. The notice, the splintered wood, the excavator's license plate. Even sick and weak, my daughter was thinking like an investigator. She'd learned from TV crime shows. Always get evidence. Marcus. I turned to see Betty Chen hurrying across the street, her silver hair flying like a banner. She'd lived here longer than anyone, the keeper of every story, every boundary line, every buried secret this neighborhood ever had. Oh, honey, she gasped, voice trembling. I am so sorry. Betty was breathless when she reached me, gripping her phone like it held the universe's secrets. I got pictures, sweetheart, she said between quick gulps of air. I saw a surveyor here last week. Karen was with him, and some hotshot architect. They were pacing around, measuring everything, talking about maximizing lakefront access for premium guests. I knew something wasn't right. Behind her, I caught sight of the neighborhood taking it all in. People stood on their porches, some whispering, others just watching. Mrs. Patterson looked stunned, her hand over her mouth. Mr. Kim shook his head in disgust. And the Hendersons, they just glanced over, then slipped back inside, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. The lines in the sand were already being drawn. Betty swiped through her phone, showing me image after image. There was Karen Whitmore, our self-appointed queen of the HOA, strutting around my property like she owned it, flanked by two men in tailored suits. One carried a tablet, the other rolled a measuring wheel across the grass. In every photo, they were pointing, first at the barn, then at the lake, then back to the barn again. Each shot was time-stamped. Last Tuesday. She'd been planning this for at least a week, probably longer, and that emergency excuse, as fake as her designer smile. Betty, can you send me all of those? I said, my voice steadier than my hands. And, do you remember exactly what they said about the lake access? I walked toward the pile of debris, Emma trailing behind me, her steps soft and ghost-like. The operator had been careful, or maybe just lucky, because a few of the thicker beams had survived the destruction. I knelt, running my fingers over the rough timber. Hand-hewn, scarred by the tools of a man who built to last. And there it was, etched deep into the wood, each line steady and precise. WSWS, 1924. William Samuel Sullivan. My great-grandfather. The man who had raised that barn during the heat of the Roaring Twenties, sleeves rolled, sweat dripping, driven by nothing more than grit and the belief that what you built with your hands would outlast you. For a moment, I could see him, hammer in hand, brow furrowed, building for a future he'd never fully see. Daddy, why would they do this? Emma leaned against me, her small head warm against my shoulder. Chemo had stolen her beautiful red hair, but not her strength. Most days, she was stronger than me, which made the rage building in my chest burn hotter. Karen Whitmore hadn't just torn down a barn. She'd ripped apart a piece of my family, while my daughter fought for her life. Emma picked up a broken plank, her finger tracing the carved initials. Great-great-grandpa would be mad, wouldn't he? Her voice was quiet but steady. He built this for us, and they just threw it away. I don't know yet, sweetheart, I said, forcing the words through the tightness in my throat. But I'm going to find out. I stood, brushing sawdust from my jeans, and something shifted inside me. The grief I'd been dragging around since Dad's funeral was still there, heavy, raw, but now it had company. Purpose. Karen wanted a fight. She'd just declared war on the wrong Sullivan. We'd protected this land for 4 generations. And I'd be damned if I let some power-hungry HOA tyrant erase that history. I pulled my phone from my pocket and started snapping my own photos. The wreckage, the so-called emergency notice, the excavator still parked on my property like a trophy of conquest. If Karen thought this was just paperwork and signatures, she was about to learn that 2 could play her game. That's when Tank Rodriguez appeared, striding down from his house 3 doors away. Tank was a Marine, a man who'd survived 3 tours before coming back to build homes instead of defend them. He moved with that quiet, steady confidence that made people feel safer just by being near him. "Brother," Tank said, voice low but sharp as a blade. "I saw what happened. This is—" He trailed off, shaking his head as his eyes swept over the destruction. He crouched down and picked through the splintered beams, his calloused hands tracing the grain like a craftsman appraising an old friend. This was good timber. Old growth. You don't bring in heavy equipment like this for a real emergency takedown. You bring it in when you want to make a statement. He turned one jagged board over, inspecting it. They didn't just knock it down. They pulverized it. Made sure you couldn't reuse a single piece to rebuild. Marcus, this was personal. Betty touched my arm, her face pale but her eyes blazing. There's something else, Marcus. Yesterday, I overheard Karen on the phone. She was talking about some Phase 2 expansion. Said she needed to secure the Sullivan property within 90 days, before the summer season. She didn't see me in my garden, but I heard every word. Phase 2. The phrase clanged in my head like an alarm bell. She didn't just want the barn gone. She wanted everything. The land, the history, the soul of this place. The barn was just her opening move. I looked around, scanning the faces of my neighbors. Some sympathetic, some curious, and some already turning away, retreating into their houses like silence could shield them from what was coming. This wasn't about property lines anymore. This was about power, about whether we'd let a bully take everything that mattered. Emma tugged gently on my shirt. "Daddy, what's that?" I followed her gaze to a glint of metal half buried in the debris. Pushing aside broken boards, I found a dented lockbox, scuffed but miraculously intact. The latch had been broken in the demolition. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dust, were yellowed photographs and old documents. My hands shook as I lifted them out, black and white photos of my great-grandfather standing proudly beside the newly built barn, shaking hands with men in dark suits, pictures of construction crews working on some kind of water system, and at the very bottom, a folded sheet of paper stamped with official county seals and ornate signatures. I stared down at the demolition notice again, my eyes tracing every line of fine print. Immediate compliance required. Mandatory safety upgrades estimated at $75,000. Failure to comply within 30 days will trigger further enforcement actions. $75,000. That was more than I'd earned in the last half year. Between Emma's treatments, hospital stays, and the bills stacking up, Karen Whitmore knew exactly what she was doing, squeezing me until I had no choice but to walk away. But as I clutched the old documents from the lockbox, a thought surfaced. Maybe she'd overplayed her hand. She'd been so focused on erasing the barn that she hadn't realized what was hidden inside it. "Come on, Em," I said quietly. "Let's get inside." I helped her up the steps, her hand like ice in mine. She was getting weaker, and Dr. Hernandez had warned me the next few months were critical. The last thing I wanted was a war with the HOA, but war had landed on my doorstep anyway. Once inside, I tucked Emma onto the couch, set her up with her iPad and a soft blanket, then drifted to the front window. The skeletal remains of the barn stared back at me. The demolition crew was packing up their gear, ready to head home to their families. The excavator operator paused, looking toward the house. There was a flicker of regret in his expression, like he knew he'd leveled more than just wood and nails. He'd flattened something irreplaceable. That barn had stood through the Great Depression, World War II, the space race, 9/11, everything. It had outlasted nearly a century of storms and change. Everything except Karen Whitmore's hunger for control. I spread the papers out on the kitchen table, the old paper crackling under my hands, and a thought rooted itself deep inside me. My great-grandfather had been smarter than she realized. William Sullivan hadn't just built to last. He'd planned ahead. Maybe he'd left something behind that could turn this fight on its head. The basement smelled like pipe tobacco and memories. Dad's domain. I hadn't been down there since the funeral. Too many ghosts. But Betty's words about old-timers knowing things echoed in my mind as I descended the creaking stairs. Dad had been meticulous, a guardian of our family's history. If there were secrets Karen didn't know, they'd be down here, buried among the old filing cabinets and battered boxes that held a century of Sullivan records. I started with the obverse: property deeds, tax records, insurance policies, all the standard paperwork of responsible ownership. Then I saw it. A heavy metal lockbox wedged behind a stack of dusty college textbooks. The lock was old, rusted but still intact. I remembered Dad showing me that box when I was about Emma's age, telling me it held the important things, and that one day I'd need to understand them. The key was exactly where he'd said it would be, taped under the workbench. My hands trembled as I fitted into the lock and heard the satisfying click. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were documents that made my pulse roar in my ears. The first was a hand-drawn map of the entire lake system, dated 1924. Every pipe, every valve, every connection between the lake and the surrounding properties was laid out with painstaking precision. At the bottom, in neat, deliberate script, W. Sullivan, Chief Water Engineer, Willowbrook County Water Trust. Then came the second document, even better. A contract, signed and sealed, granting the Sullivan family perpetual water easement rights and emergency management authority over the entire lake system. The signatures were official: the county commissioner, the state water authority, and 3 prominent local businessmen as witnesses. The language was formal, even archaic, but its meaning was undeniable. My family, my bloodline, legally controlled the water rights that kept Karen's prized resort in business. Holy! I stopped myself, biting back the word out of respect for the space and for Dad. This changes everything. Karen thought she was untouchable because she ran the HOA, but she'd been playing checkers on a chessboard my great-grandfather had built. He hadn't just owned a piece of land. He designed the entire system that made this community possible. And then I found it, the 3rd document. A letter dated 1925, from the county commissioner himself, thanking William Sullivan for his service and confirming that water management authority would pass to his heirs in perpetuity. The letter even mentioned the emergency control valve, the same valve sitting quietly at the edge of our property, noting that it was critical for flood control and community safety. Daddy! I turned to see Emma at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. She looked pale, but alert. Her chemo schedule had her sleeping in fragments these days. What are you doing down there? I climbed the steps and handed her the papers, explaining what they meant as simply as I could. Her wide eyes blinked up at me as the pieces clicked in her mind. So, great-great-grandpa was like the boss of the whole lake. Her voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. Yeah, sweetheart, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. He kind of was. Her face lit up, a spark of energy cutting through her fatigue. Does that mean we can tell Karen she can't have our land? Straight to the heart of it, like always. It means, I said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, that we have options. But first, I need to have a little chat with our dear HOA president. Once Emma was settled back in bed, I laid the documents out across the kitchen table like battle plans. Karen had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for the next evening, no doubt to discuss the so-called safety concerns and my failure to comply. She expected me to show up defeated, maybe even desperate enough to talk sale prices. But the next night, I walked into the community center with a manila folder tucked under my arm and Emma holding my hand. Tank had offered to stay with her during the meeting, but she'd shaken her head. I want to see you tell Karen about great-great-grandpa, she'd said, her voice steady despite the fatigue. How could I argue? She'd been through hell. If watching her dad stand up to a bully gave her even a little strength, she deserved a front-row seat. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. Karen sat at the front like a corporate monarch, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. About 30 neighbors filled the folding chairs. Most wore the same uneasy expression, people caught between fear and curiosity. Karen had called this meeting, but from the way the crowd shifted in their seats, I could tell her story about community safety wasn't landing the way she'd hoped. I rose from my chair, feeling Emma's small hand tighten around mine, her silent way of saying, "You've got this, Dad. Thank you for that colorful presentation, Karen," I began, my voice steady but sharp enough to cut glass. I particularly liked the part where you referred to my great-grandfather's barn as an unauthorized structure. That's fascinating, because according to these records, I tapped the folder in my hand, William Sullivan built that barn in 1924 as part of his responsibilities as chief water engineer for the Willowbrook County Water Trust. The room went still. Karen's perfect smile twitched, just for a heartbeat, before snapping back into place like a mask. I stepped forward, my voice carrying through the quiet. Would you like to explain to everyone here why you authorized the demolition of a structure that was not only legal but also a key component of the original water system that created the very lake your resort depends on? I opened my folder and held up copies of the original documents. The color drained from Karen's face, replaced by a flush of anger. "Those papers are fake," she snapped. "Old documents can be forged." "Betty," I said calmly. From the back of the room, Betty Chen rose, phone in hand. "I have photographs of Karen meeting with surveyors and architects on Marcus's property last week, long before any emergency demolition was declared." Karen froze, but the damage was already done. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a ripple of disbelief and outrage spreading through the room. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen with Emma, learning how to set up a live stream. She adjusted the angle, making sure the wreckage of the barn filled the frame behind me. She'd even put on a little makeup, dabbing concealer under her tired eyes, determined, she said, to look strong for Daddy's movie. God, I love that kid. All right, I said, hitting the record button. Let's talk about water rights and what happens when an HOA president decides the rules don't apply to her. I held up the original 1924 documents, careful to keep them in full view of the camera. My name is Marcus Sullivan. 3 days ago, while I was at the hospital with my daughter for her cancer treatment, the Willowbrook HOA demolished my great-grandfather's barn. They called it an emergency demolition for community safety. The live view account ticked upward. Tank had shared the link as soon as it went live, followed by Betty, Rick, and half the neighborhood. Comments poured in, angry emojis, questions, people demanding answers. Here's what they didn't tell you, I continued, stepping closer to the camera so the debris loomed perfectly behind me. My great-grandfather, William Sullivan, was the chief engineer who designed and built the water system that formed this lake. He secured perpetual water rights that have been passed down to his heirs. That means me. And my daughter, Emma. I turned slightly, gesturing toward her. She gave a little wave from her chair, her smile so bright it lit up the frame. The comments exploded with hearts and words of support. People love an underdog story, and this one came with a sick kid and a destroyed family legacy. Now, I said, my tone hardening, you might be wondering why the HOA president would risk legal trouble by tearing down a historic structure. Let me read you something. I pulled a printout from Rick's flash drive and read aloud. From Karen Whitmore. To Investor Group. Subject: Phase 2 expansion. Phase 2 expansion requires lakefront access. The Sullivan property is the key. Barn demolition is scheduled for Thursday during his daughter's treatment. Emergency clause gives us legal cover. The view account spiked. 10,000 and climbing, the comments scrolling too quickly to read. But the message was clear. Outrage. Karen had made her biggest mistake. She hadn't just picked a fight with a grieving single dad. She'd done it in full view of the court of public opinion, and the jury wasn't on her side. So, here's where we stand, I said, walking toward the edge of the property line. The camera followed, catching the shimmering surface of the lake and, across the water, the pristine docks and expensive cabins of Willowbrook Resort. All of that over there, every boat, every faucet, every drop of water, runs through a system my great-grandfather designed and my family still has authority over. I'm not going to do anything reckless. I'm not going to break the law. But I am going to exercise my legal rights as trustee of this water system. And Karen Whitmore is about to learn that actions have consequences. I ended the stream with Emma at my side, the two of us framed against the pile of rubble that had once been our barn. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, destruction behind us, resolve in front of us. By the next morning, the video had been viewed over 15,000 times and shared 847 times. Local Facebook groups were flooded with posts about HOA corruption, water rights, and calls for Karen's resignation. Her response came less than a day later, a certified letter from Hartwell and Associates, threatening lawsuits for defamation, invasion of privacy, and inciting community unrest. The demand was clear: take down the video, issue a public apology, or face the full weight of their legal machine. But I wasn't taking the video down. Not now. Not ever. The letter Karen sent wasn't just a legal threat. It also included a formal complaint she'd filed with the county, accusing me of making unauthorized modifications to the water system, a bold claim, considering I hadn't touched a single thing. That same afternoon, I decided to test the waters, quite literally. Emma walked beside me, iPad in hand, ready to record everything for documentation. We followed the old map from 1924, and sure enough, the valve system was exactly where my great-grandfather's note said it would be, tucked away behind a weathered maintenance shed most folks probably assumed belonged to the county. Then Tuesday morning came. At 6 a.m., a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of my house, tinted windows, engine humming quietly, and a man inside who looked like he could lift small vehicles for a workout. By noon, Surveillance cameras were suddenly mounted on the utility poles around my property, all pointed directly at my home, my front door, backyard, even the narrow trail leading to the lake. Emma peeked through the living room curtains, her little voice trembling. "Daddy, why is that man just sitting there?" I kept my tone calm, though a storm of anger churned in my chest. "Karen thinks she can scare us into giving up," I told her, my voice steady. "But she's about to find out Sullivan men don't scare that easy." But the cameras were just the opening shot. By Thursday, every mailbox in the neighborhood had been stuffed with a glossy, 8-page pamphlet titled, in bold letters, "Marcus Sullivan, a threat assessment." It was a professional SME campaign. The cover was a freeze frame from my Facebook Live video, but doctored to make me look menacing, with the words "Water Terrorist" splashed in angry red font. Hank came by, pamphlet in hand, his expression grim. "Brother," he said, shaking his head, "this is some next-level psychological warfare. She paid serious money for this hit piece." Inside, the lies were wrapped in just enough truth to sound legitimate. Fake testimonials from concerned residents. Quotes from supposed structural engineers warning about flood risks. Even a timeline of my so-called escalating hostility toward the HOA. The pamphlet didn't stop there. It dragged Emma into the mud, insinuating that my stress over her illness made me unstable, unpredictable, even dangerous. It cited imaginary neighbors claiming they feared for their safety and property values. The most twisted section portrayed my Facebook livestream as some kind of radicalization video, comparing it to extremist recruitment tactics. The social fallout was immediate. By the weekend, people stopped waving when I drove past. Conversations died the second I walked into the general store. And then came the gut punch. Emma's best friend, Zoe, didn't show up for their usual art session. Confused, Emma called. Zoe's mom answered instead, her tone cold and clipped. "I'm sorry, Emma," she said, "but Zoe can't come over anymore. Your father's behavior is concerning to a lot of families right now." Emma ended the call slowly, staring at the floor, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mrs. Peterson said I can't play with Zoe anymore," she whispered. "Because you're dangerous." Am I not allowed to have friends now?" Something in me broke then, clean and sharp, like glass shattering. Karen had crossed a line. She wasn't just coming for my property or my reputation. She'd gone after my daughter. My 12-year-old girl, who'd already lost enough to cancer, was now losing her friends too. I crouched in front of her, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Emma, listen to me. Some people are afraid of the truth. They are scared to stand up to someone like Karen. That doesn't make them bad. It just makes them scared. But I placed my hand gently over hers, we don't let fear decide what's right and what's wrong." That same afternoon, I discovered her next move, a 47-page legal petition filed with the county court. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Professional photos of my property, fabricated engineering assessments warning of critical flood risks, pages of community testimonials about my hostile refusal to cooperate. The entire document framed my land as essential for flood control upgrades and painted me as a reckless obstacle putting the entire neighborhood at risk. The proposed improvements came with a $2.3 million price tag, conveniently funded by emergency assessments that somehow excluded Karen's resort properties. And then, the cruelest twist, a section exploiting Emma's illness. It claimed that my resistance jeopardized emergency access routes for families with medical needs, using her cancer treatments as the emotional linchpin for taking my land. I was still processing the audacity of it when Tank knocked on my truck window that evening. Behind him stood Betty, Rick, and a dozen other neighbors I never expected to see together, people who, just a week ago, had kept their distance. Tank spoke for the group, his jaw tight with anger. "Marcus," he said, "we've been talking. This pamphlet, these lies, we're done with it. Karen's gone too far." Betty stepped forward, a folder clutched in her hands, thick with documents. "I've been digging around," I admitted, shoving a stack of papers across the table. "Karen's resort is claiming major financial losses on her taxes, but her Instagram and Facebook are full of booked-out weekends and photos of champagne dinners, spa renovations, and luxury upgrades. The numbers don't add up." Rick leaned forward, lowering his voice. I think she's cooking the books. At the hardware store, we see everything. She's been paying cash for surveillance gear, printing supplies, even high-end locks, and she's been asking weird questions about the water shut-off system and the emergency access codes. The phone jolted me awake at 3:17 a.m., shattering the first stretch of real sleep I'd had in weeks. On the other end, Dr. Hernandez spoke in her usual calm, measured tone, but beneath it, I caught the urgency. "Marcus," she said gently, "I need you to bring Emma to the hospital immediately. Her blood work from yesterday, there are some changes we can't ignore." I turned, and Emma was already awake, sitting upright in bed, her eyes too wise for 12 years old. "Is it time, Daddy?" she asked softly. She knew. Of course she knew. Kids who fight cancer always know more than we give them credit for. We talked about this possibility, that one day, her body would make the decision for us. The day when the transplant couldn't wait any longer. The next 6 hours blurred together, medical terms I only half understood, a parade of doctors and nurses, and a series of choices no parent should ever have to make. Emma's white blood cell count had plummeted. Her body was losing the battle. The transplant had to happen now. The total cost will be around $500,000, Dr. Hernandez said softly. If your insurance signs off, your out-of-pocket should be about $50,000. If they don't. She didn't need to finish. Without approval, there would be no transplant. Without the transplant, Emma wouldn't survive. And even if I found the money some other way, it would destroy me financially. From Emma's hospital room, I spent an hour in an endless loop of hold music and transfers before finally reaching the supervisor handling her case. "Mr. Sullivan," said Linda Morrison, her voice sharp and detached, every syllable coated in corporate indifference. "Your daughter's case is under extended review due to questions regarding your family's financial stability and community support systems." The phrase hit like a punch. Community support systems. Somehow, Karen had inserted herself into my daughter's medical file. Later that afternoon, she appeared at the hospital, sweeping in with a bouquet of flowers and a carefully practiced look of sympathy. "Marcus," she began, voice dripping with false warmth, "I just heard about Emma. I'm so sorry. I know we've had our disagreements, but moments like this, they remind us that community matters." I didn't answer. "I want to help," she continued, settling into the visitor's chair without being invited. "I spoke with Linda Morrison at Blue Cross. She's an old friend from college, and she's very concerned about Emma's case. The approval process can be complicated, especially when there are questions about family stability." I stared at her, my jaw clenched. "I have a proposal," she said smoothly, as though reading from a script. $750,000. That's fair market value for your property, plus a little extra for the inconvenience. If you agree to sell, it demonstrates community cooperation and financial security. Linda can expedite the insurance approval, and I'll make sure there are no delays with Emma's treatment. Think of it as resolving our differences." I looked at Emma, fragile and pale in her hospital bed, then back at Karen. "You're holding my daughter's life hostage," I said, my voice steady but ice-cold, "just to steal my land." Karen tilted her head, almost pitying. "I'm offering to solve your financial problems and guarantee your daughter's care. But Marcus, the transplant window won't stay open forever." When she left, Emma squeezed my hand. "Daddy," she whispered, "she's not helping me, is she?" "No, sweetheart," I said quietly. "She's using you." Her brow furrowed. I heard her. In the hallway. She was on the phone. She said something about pressure points and an inevitable conclusion. "She's trying to hurt us." That evening, Tank showed up at the hospital with Jennifer Hayes. They spread a stack of documents across the tiny rolling table by Emma's bed. "Marcus," Jennifer said, her voice sharp with controlled anger, "we found the link. Karen's company donated $50,000 to Blue Cross's Community Health Initiative. The same week Emma's claim was flagged for review. And the donation, it was earmarked for supporting families in need within this coverage area. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen hadn't just crossed a line, she'd built a criminal empire on the other side of it." I looked at Emma. She had her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, but I knew she was listening. "Daddy," she whispered after a moment, her voice trembling but steady. What would great-great-grandpa do? I thought about William Sullivan, a man who had built water systems with his own 2 hands so his neighbors could drink, farm, and live better lives. He'd protect his family first, I said softly, but he'd also protect everyone else. He wouldn't let someone like Karen use fear and power to hurt people. Emma nodded slowly, then reached for Jennifer's phone. Can I record a message? She asked. I want everyone to know what Karen is doing to us. That night, sleep never came. Emma's words kept circling in my mind, over and over, like a storm I couldn't escape. She's using my illness to take our home. Those words looped in my head like a broken record. Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She'd twisted my daughter's fight for her life into nothing more than a bargaining chip in a real estate deal. I looked over at Emma sleeping, her small body surrounded by tubes, the soft beeping of monitors filling the room. The wires and machines felt less like protection and more like a steel fortress, guarding her fragile world. Something inside me shifted in that moment, something sharp, cold, and absolute. No more hesitation. No more restraint. Karen wanted to play power games with water rights. Fine. She was about to learn the hard way why you never corner a Sullivan, not when his family is on the line. The walk to the dam's valve felt almost sacred, a solemn march through the shadows. My flashlight cut narrow slices of light through the thick night, illuminating the path my great-grandfather had walked more than 100 years ago when he built this system to serve everyone who called this land home. The valve was exactly where his hand-drawn map said it would be, tucked behind a wall of wild, overgrown brush that hadn't been cut back in decades. The mechanism looked ancient, like a relic from a bygone era, a massive iron wheel connected to brass fittings weathered to a dull green patina. This was it, the heart of the lake's entire system. One turn here, and every pipe feeding every property along the shore, including Karen's precious resort, would run dry. I rested my hands on the cold metal, feeling the history etched into every groove, every scratch. William Sullivan had designed it to be operated by hand, believing that control over something this vital should never be left to machines. He believed that decisions carrying this much weight demanded human judgment and human accountability. The wheel resisted me at first, stiff with rust and years of silence. My muscles strained as I forced it to move, the old iron groaning like it resented being disturbed after so long. But Sullivans don't quit. With every ounce of strength, I pushed harder, feeling the layers of age and corrosion crack and crumble under my grip. Slowly, agonizingly, the valve began to turn, the sound of grinding metal echoing through the night. Each rotation wasn't just a movement of gears, it was a statement. This wasn't about water pressure anymore. This was about sending a message. Some things, family, dignity, the right of a child to live, are never up for negotiation. I thought of Emma lying in that hospital bed, fighting for her life, while Karen bartered her survival like a poker chip. I thought of William Sullivan, who had built this system for the good of the community. And I thought of Karen Whitmore, trying to rip it apart to feed nothing but her own greed. Every turn of that wheel felt like justice, like evening the scales after years of watching her bully and manipulate everyone around her. With one last, forceful twist, the valve locked into place. The sound was sharp and final, a heavy click that cracked through the still night like a judge's gavel announcing a verdict. Silence followed. Heavy, absolute silence. No more water flowing through those ancient pipes. No more lifeline for the empire Karen had built on intimidation and selfishness. I stood there in the dark, chest heaving from the effort, feeling the full weight of my family's legacy settle on my shoulders. William Sullivan had built this system to protect the people of this lake. Tonight, I was honoring that promise, protecting my daughter, my land, and sending an unmistakable message: greed carries consequences. By sunrise, Karen's empire had collapsed into chaos. The infinity pool had dropped nearly 4 feet overnight, leaving behind algae-stained concrete that looked like something dragged from a forgotten swamp. The perfectly green lawns were already fading to brown under the August sun, their automatic sprinklers hissing uselessly as empty pipes coughed like dying machines. The golf course, a cracked wasteland. The water hazards had turned to dry mud pits, where her overpriced koi thrashed helplessly in shrinking puddles. Guests stormed out in droves, rolling suitcases over what, just 12 hours ago, had been a meticulously maintained paradise. Her call came at 6:15 a.m., her voice sharp and ragged, like barbed wire slicing through the calm of the morning. "You lunatic!" she screamed. "You're ruining people's vacations. I'll have you arrested for sabotage." I stood on the bluff overlooking the drained lake, watching the sunlight creep across the empty basin, turning the cracked mud into bands of gold, just as painted by the dawn. "You tried to ruin my daughter's life," I said, my tone steady and cool. "Now you know what it feels like to have someone else hold the power over something you can't live without." The resort, her weapon against my family, was nothing more than a hollow shell now, a parking lot of broken promises and drying mud. Exactly as I'd sworn it would be. "Turn the water back on this second, or I'll—" "You'll what, Karen?" I interrupted, calm and unshaken. "Call Linda. Threaten me again. That game is over. Your reign here is done." I ended the call and headed back to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. For the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of something warm flickered in my chest. Hope. Not just for Emma's recovery, but for the possibility that our community could rise above people like Karen Whitmore. Tomorrow, I'd face the county commissioners with everything I had. Karen had assumed that grief and desperation would make me easy to break. She was wrong. When you've already lost almost everything, fear stops being part of the equation, and strength is all that's left. The meeting room at the county building was overflowing, packed to the walls. News of Emma's message had spread across social media like wildfire. The story, a homeowner association president leveraging a child's illness to gain power, had touched something raw and primal in the people around us. By the time we arrived, Jennifer's live stream had drawn more than 8,000 viewers and was climbing by the minute. Emma sat beside me in her wheelchair, looking so small but radiating quiet bravery. She wore her favorite purple dress and a baseball cap that read Team Sullivan, a gift from Tank's Marine buddies who had driven 3 hours just to be there. She had insisted on attending, even though her body was weak from treatments. Great-great-great-grandpa would want me to be here, she had whispered that morning, her voice trembling but determined. Then Karen made her entrance. She swept in like a CEO walking into a boardroom, trailed by an entourage that screamed money and influence, 3 attorneys in tailored suits, 2 sharp-looking men who had to be investors, and a woman glued to her phone with a leather briefcase balanced on her arm. Karen herself wore a stiff, conservative suit, the picture of a polished community leader. Commissioner Bradley banged the gavel to bring order. "We're here to discuss concerns regarding water rights management and HOA governance in the Willowbrook area," he announced. "Mr. Sullivan, you requested this forum. The floor is yours." I rose to my feet, clutching the folder that held everything, the evidence, the timelines, the truth. "My name is Marcus Sullivan," I began, steadying my voice. 5 weeks ago, while I was away with my daughter for her cancer treatments, the Willowbrook HOA demolished my family's barn, a structure my great-grandfather built nearly a century ago. They claimed it was an emergency demolition for safety. What I'm about to show you will prove it was nothing of the sort. It was a calculated move, a step in a plan designed to drive us off our own land. I laid out the timeline first. The secret surveys Karen had commissioned. The so-called emergency notice. The inflated, impossible fees. Then came the original water rights deed from 1924, complete with county documentation that confirmed my family's perpetual easement. And finally, the proof of Karen's planned Phase 2 expansion. Then I turned to what mattered most. "Commissioners, my daughter Emma needs a bone marrow transplant. Our insurance company has delayed approval for her treatment, and in the process of investigating, I discovered something disturbing. Mrs. Whitmore has been communicating with executives at our insurance provider, referencing our family's stability and standing in the community." The reaction in the room was immediate. Murmurs turned into sharp whispers. Someone near the back shouted, "That's disgusting." Another voice growled, "She's using a sick kid for leverage." I nodded toward Jennifer, who pressed play on Emma's video. Her voice, soft, tired, but impossibly strong, filled the room. "My name is Emma Sullivan. I have leukemia, and I need a bone marrow transplant to survive. Mrs. Whitmore is making my daddy choose between saving me and saving our home. That's not fair. That's not right." The room fell silent. So silent it hurt. I caught glimpses of people dabbing at their eyes, even a few commissioners struggling to keep their composure. Karen's face had drained of color, her mask cracking right there in front of everyone. I pressed on. In addition, I continued, there's documented proof that Mrs. Whitmore has repeatedly violated federal water management regulations. Her resort has been exceeding its permitted water draw for years, and she's made unauthorized modifications to the intake systems to feed her property. Thanks to Freedom of Information Act requests filed by Jennifer here, I have the official EPA inspection reports. These violations date back 3 years and have caused significant environmental damage. What's more, they open the door for potential federal criminal charges. Commissioner Martinez leaned forward, his voice sharp. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have a response to these allegations? Karen rose, visibly shaken but still trying to cling to her carefully constructed image. Commissioners, she began, her voice brittle. Mr. Sullivan is, understandably emotional due to his family's personal situation. But the reality is, he's been making dangerous, unauthorized modifications to essential water infrastructure. He's threatened the safety of our entire community. My only concern has been to protect our neighborhood from his increasingly unstable and erratic behavior. Erratic behavior. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it as I pulled my phone from my pocket. Commissioners, I said, before you take her word for anything, I'd like you to hear these recordings. They were obtained legally under our state's single-party consent law. The first clip played loud and clear. Karen's unmistakable voice. Marcus needs to understand that cooperation with the community affects everything: property values, insurance approvals, even medical priorities. Families who work with the HOA receive better support during emergencies. The room erupted. Gasps, angry shouts, disbelief. Then the second recording. Linda, it's Karen. About the Sullivan insurance claim. The family's community integration is questionable. They've been uncooperative with our neighborhood improvement initiatives, and there are ongoing concerns about their stability. By the time the audio ended, you could have heard a pin drop. One more review might convince them. Karen's voice played through the speakers, cold and calculated. They need to understand that cooperation with the community is non-negotiable. The room erupted. Commissioners were shouting over one another, audience members leapt to their feet, and Karen's attorney swarmed around her, whispering in frantic urgency. But Karen, she wasn't listening to anyone. She was unraveling right there in front of us. I was protecting this community, she screamed, her voice bouncing off the walls like a warning siren. After my son died, this place became everything to me. Everything. I won't let anyone tear down what I've built. And then, the fatal words. If Marcus Sullivan thinks he can use his sick daughter to manipulate this neighborhood, he's wrong. I've sacrificed too much to let one emotional father ruin everything. A deafening silence followed. Even her lawyers froze, stunned. Every eye in the room turned toward her, the weight of her own words sinking like a stone. Beside me, Emma squeezed my hand, her small fingers trembling but steady. Commissioner Bradley's voice sliced through the tension, sharp as ice. Miss Whitmore, he said evenly, did you just admit to exploiting a child's illness to gain leverage in a property dispute? Karen blinked, as if only just realizing what she'd said. But it didn't matter. The damage was done, captured in high definition, broadcast live to over 12,000 viewers on Jennifer's stream. The domino effect started almost immediately. Within 2 days, the FBI announced an investigation into Karen's illegal water usage and public corruption. The State Attorney General's office launched its own probe into tax evasion. By the end of the week, the county stripped her of her HOA presidency and placed the board under court supervision for reorganization. But the most unexpected call came from Linda Morrison, the insurance supervisor who had been stonewalling Emma's surgery approval. Her tone was clipped but careful. Blue Cross had re-evaluated its priorities, she explained. Emma's bone marrow transplant had been moved to top-tier status, fully covered. No delays, no conditions. The company wanted nothing to do with the public relations nightmare of being linked to medical extortion. Emma's surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. Dr. Hernandez smiled when she told me the news. You're the donor, Marcus, she said. Perfect match. Genetics and love working hand in hand. Emma beamed at me, her eyes bright despite the fatigue. See, Daddy, great-great-great-grandpa is still looking out for us. From that point, Karen's empire unraveled like a frayed rope. The EPA filed charges for years of environmental violations, slapping her with crippling fines that forced her to start liquidating properties. The tax fraud investigation uncovered hidden income streams that sealed her fate, criminal charges, frozen accounts, and seized assets. Then came the final blow, her investors. The viral video of her public breakdown torpedoed her reputation. Contracts were cancelled. Support evaporated. Within 2 weeks, her entire fortune was gone, sold off to pay for mounting legal fees and investor demands. Meanwhile, Emma's transplant was a complete success. The surgery went smoothly. 6 weeks later, her blood counts were stable, her strength returning in steady waves. The first curls of her new hair, bright red like her mother's, peeked out beneath her favorite cap. She celebrated by painting again, her delicate brush strokes capturing the lake in warm, vivid colors. I want to remember why great-great-grandpa built this for everyone, she told me, her voice soft but proud. The commissioners, in a rare moment of unanimous agreement, voted to honor my family's original deed. The water rights were formally transferred into public trust, safeguarded for generations to come. And when the system officially became a community-managed resource, the people elected me as their first water trustee. I accepted, not for pride, but because I knew I was continuing the work my great-grandfather had started nearly a century ago. Karen eventually pleaded guilty to federal corruption and tax fraud charges. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She lost everything: her businesses, her wealth, her standing in the community. In the end, the woman who had tried to steal my family's legacy was left with nothing but a cell and the bitter truth that her own greed had destroyed her. The day Emma finally came home from the hospital, Tank threw a welcome-back barbecue in our backyard. It turned into something bigger, a celebration of survival, of unity, of community. Kids splashed in the lake, neighbors shared food and laughter, and everywhere I looked, I saw people talking excitedly about plans for the new water board. 6 months later, we cut the ribbon on the William Sullivan Community Center, built on the very spot where the barn once stood before Karen ordered its demolition. The building honored the past while looking to the future, historical displays of the lake's creation alongside modern rooms for meetings, programs for kids, and facilities for emergencies. Emma designed the memorial garden herself, a peaceful spot where anyone could sit and watch the water. At the center, mounted on polished stone, was a bronze plaque etched with her words. Water belongs to everyone. Communities are built by people who care more about tomorrow than today. William Sullivan, 1924 to 1954, and all who continue his work. One summer morning, Emma appeared beside me, healthy and vibrant, carrying a new watercolor. This one showed the lake bathed in sunrise light, the community center shining in the background, families gathered on the shore. At the bottom, in her neat script, she had written, "Some things are worth fighting for." She looked up at me, her smile brighter than the morning sun. "Ready for the next adventure, Daddy?" I turned to take it all in, the lake, the center, the neighbors who had become family, and my daughter, who had taught me what real courage looks like. "Yeah, Em," I said, my voice thick but steady. "I'm ready." Because William Sullivan had built a dam to serve his community. Karen Whitmore had tried to steal it for profit. But in the end, justice flowed, like the water itself, freely and for everyone. And if this story stirs something in you, if you believe in standing up to bullies, in protecting the people and places that matter most, then share it. Share it with anyone who's ever been backed into a corner, with anyone who knows what it means to fight for family, for community, for what's right. Because sometimes, ordinary people can do extraordinary things, especially when they have nothing left to lose.